This is a review of the 1948 Anatole Litvak film, The Snake Pit. This movie stars Olivia de Havilland, Mark Stevens, Leo Genn, Celeste Holm, and Leif Erikson, but not that Leif Erikson. Someone named Millen Brand wrote the screenplay, which to me sounds like some form of Quaker cereal. Overall, the cereal did a great job and wrote a fantastic movie. This is an annoyingly good movie. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll tell you, but first, we got to talk a little bit about Olivia de Havilland, who's one of the reasons to see this movie, without a doubt. A lot of people know Olivia de Havilland from Gone with the Wind. She plays an extremely endearing character. Melanie, I think is her name. Been a long time. And that kind of defined a big part of how she was perceived as an actress in her career to some extent. But maybe not everyone realizes that she was a phenomenal actress in her own right. You go watch The Heiress, you go watch In This Our Life, and you'll very quickly realize that Olivia de Havilland was absolutely the real deal. So, interestingly, Olivia de Havilland was the sister of Joan Fontaine. Not everybody knows that. She was also related to the guy who founded the de Havilland Airplane Company that built the de Havilland Comet, which was the first commercial jet airliner, and built a lot of, I think, wooden airplanes during the World Wars. So, some interesting trivia, a great part of this movie, but annoyingly good. What does that mean? Well, basically it means that in a lot of ways this movie isn't that great, and many times I found myself rolling my eyes thinking, why did they do that? And yet, a few moments later, I'd think, dang, this movie's great. They got me, they pulled me in, I've become attached, I'm compelled, I want to keep watching it, I want to tell people about this movie. But why was it annoying in the first place? Well, it's kind of what you can imagine. So this movie is about a woman who has a mental breakdown, basically, and goes to an asylum, is committed to an asylum, which ends up being a bit of a roller coaster for her. The conditions there, in some places are maybe what you'd expect, in other places are pretty bad, and it's a powerful and interesting experience all along. In 1948, was Hollywood really at a point to tackle that kind of a subject matter, that sort of psychological themes? Could they really do it justice? Well, this movie gets close, but all the bad parts of it are the hokey, heavy-handed, mechanical bits of movies from the 40s. Now, in some movies, this is great. In, tricky film noir films with a lot of different moving pieces and different connections, you're trying to find the killer and such, and slowly it's revealed, and there's a bunch of interesting clockwork. All this logic is set up one way, and then something changes, and you realize, oh, well, that means that this is like this, or something along those lines. But does that kind of thing really suit sort of a psychological movie, a sincere film about mental illness and recovery? Well, no. But that's what the movie tries to do. It essentially treats this mental health thing like it's a murder mystery. The movie basically tries to hunt down the inciting trauma and something along those lines. When I reviewed The Slender Thread on this channel a few months ago, which is a movie that came out a little bit later in the early 60s, I think, and is also sort of about mental health, one thing I commended that movie about is that it is not a search. It has a very ambiguous, it leaves the door completely open for what exactly the causes may have been, or at least it's very clear that it's not sort of one thing. Exactly. Now, in this movie, they actually say, well, it's not just one thing. Remember that there were two inciting traumas in your childhood or something along those lines. So they say that, but the reality is that this movie is told in flashback. It's told like a film noir to some degree, where the killer is some sort of inciting traumatic thing that once revealed will resolve all the issues or something along those lines. And that's hokey. That sort of mechanics, yeah, like I said, that's what made me roll my eyes a lot. There's other things too. There's sort of a bland romantic backdrop. The husband is, in general, a strong character, but the romance is just a little bit bland, kind of 40s romance. Happens overnight, of course. And there's many times where sort of some of the events in de Havilland's character's life are revealed, and the husband at first says he just has no idea what's up, what could be wrong. And when you learn about some of these events, you'd think, well, surely if they'd actually spoken to each other for, more than half an hour, he would know some of these things, because it's not exactly like they're, hidden or secret or something along those lines. So kind of hokey. It's also worth noting that there's kind of a hokey patriarchal aspect of this film as well. But like I said, this is a good movie, and I was rolling my eyes at times. And yet, here I am suggesting that you watch it because for the most part, it really, really delivers. And that's why I say that it's annoyingly good. It is an interesting question, too, I think, about how much you should suspend your disbelief when watching older movies. And I don't really have an answer for that here. It's a complicated question. I might do a whole video about it, actually, because I do have a lot of thoughts about it. But, when you see these eye roll moments, should you turn the movie off? Well, in this case, I don't think so. But is that a general rule? Well, I don't know. Anyway, I will give the movie some credit because it mainly sidesteps hysteria, which is kind of an unfortunate trope of the times. Hysteria in the 40s in film only applied to women, of course. Like I said, just sort of an unfortunate trope that you can see in tons and tons of different movies where the drama might be something along the lines of whether or not the woman is hysterical, basically, teetering on the edge of that or something like that. There's a lot of movies that are kind of defined by that, which is kind of lame in my opinion. This movie doesn't really do that, which I think is cool. So what's good about this movie? Well, like I said, it's a great movie. It pulls you in really from the start. And actually, the movie has a really interesting beginning that will very quickly introduce you to some of the interesting things about it. It'll introduce you to the acting. It'll introduce you to the dynamics of the movie, the dynamism, which is one of the strongest parts about it. It will tell you that the movie's ahead of its time, really from very early on. That's pretty cool. But let me be more specific about some of these things. So first of all, let's start with an easy one, which is the acting. The acting's great in this movie. And there's one thing that's really interesting about it, in particular, which is that it is not glamorous at all. So Olivia de Havilland, big star, right, normally would have some sort of fancy gowns to wear in a movie, normally would have, a bit of a get up and such, and would be in soft lighting and such and built up as this star. In this movie, maybe there is some sort of empathetic energy in the same way, even as her character with Gone with the Wind, where she sometimes plays these sort of bad luck, downtrodden characters or something like that. Maybe there's some similarity there, but for the most part, this movie seems like almost completely different from anything else I've seen her in. And I've only seen her in 3 or 4 movies, but here she does not play a glamorous character at all. She plays quite a naturalistic role, and is, like I said, just in terms of acting, really, really good in this movie. Celeste Holm is also in this movie, and this is an even stronger example, really, because Celeste Holm very commonly plays sort of a refined character. I don't know the best way to describe it exactly, but I think refined's a pretty good sort of distinguished, sort of proper, sort of prim in some ways, but not like stuck up, but another very endearing character, usually, who's sort of refined, upstanding, nice, likable sort of character or something along these lines. And that is usually reflected in, having a refined, likable, prim outfit and wardrobe and such, and being a housewife in a big house or something along those lines. But in this movie, she's a patient at the asylum, and the vibe is just completely different. And so, like I said, from pretty early on, you'll realize, oh, this movie is quite a bit different from a lot of the other things that would be made around that time. And this is one of the big reasons. The style is another part of this. The style of this movie is eclectic, it's interesting, it's all over the place, and it's ahead of its time. There's a lot of movies that are ahead of their time, to be honest, and it's an interesting question what it even means for something to be of its time or something like that. For instance, you might watch Breathless, and you hear about the jump cuts, revolutionary in Breathless or something like that. But there are many films that use jump cuts. Go check out Mr. Blanding's Dream House, for instance, an interesting movie from 1948, same year as this movie. There's some jump cuts in that movie. There's jump cuts in other movies, particularly maybe in like musicals or something like that. There'd be all kinds of experimental style going on years before it might be hailed as part of the New Wave or some other big movement. Now, that's not to devalue the ideas of the New Wave or something, because, they put a lot of pieces together, and it is rightly so a revolution. But the point is that, like I said, there's a lot of stuff before its time. This is one of them. And one stylistic element in particular that, great parallel to the jump cuts in Mr. Blanding's Dream House is the whip pans. There are a lot of whip pans in this movie. The whip pan is not typically thought of a whole lot in terms of classic style in Hollywood, right? And usually in your Film 101 textbook, they'll tell you that the classic style, 1917 to 1960, the goal of it was to do invisible style, invisible editing, where the film would be made so that you wouldn't really even notice it was a film or something. It would just be so effortless, naturally cutting between things, shot, reverse shot patterns. Well, the whip pan does not fall into that category. The whip pan is, hello, look at the style, look, a camera moving quickly. Interesting choice there. And that sort of thing, being able to see the style, again, refer to your Film Studies 101 textbooks, that's kind of a thing you'd expect from the New Wave to some degree. But here it is in 1948 in this interesting movie. So they maybe even overuse the whip pan in this film, to be honest. There's 3 or 4 of them, I think. But like I said, interesting style. There's other stylistic things that are maybe more subtle. So the locations in this movie are really strong. Seems like it was filmed in a lot of real places to some degree. Whether or not that's just like the New York apartment that you see from time to time, great apartment, gotta say. I wish I could get a place like that today. Or it's like, there's a cafe at one point. I think this is when they're in Chicago. They eat at the cafe, and you can look out the window and see people walking around on the street, which is like, hey, that's cool. Just a little bit of extra detail in this movie. And in general, this movie seems to have a lot of sort of grit and a lot of detail, a lot of stuff in the background. And sometimes this is sort of explicitly foregrounded as well. For instance, there's a great scene during one of the staff interview sections. There's a great scene where there's sort of loud rain outside and there's heavy rain on the windows. And at first it's just sort of an interesting background element, but it comes into play to sort of illustrate de Havilland's character's mental health to some degree. Speaking of illustrating mental health, there's a couple really off-the-wall scenes that do that in very experimental ways that you may or may not expect, which is pretty cool. The sound in this movie is interesting. Again, you'll notice this really from the start, from sort of scene 1. You'll notice interesting use of sound. You'll notice great lighting in this movie. There's a couple of scenes that have sort of a German expressionism influence with the big shadows. At the same time, it's not an overpowering thing. This is a pretty realistic movie, but it does a good job of balancing that with the sound, with the lighting, just interesting kind of out there ideas to some extent. Really, overall, this is a very eclectic film, stylistically. I think I said this already, but it's not really much of a genre film, even though I mentioned earlier it's kind of looking like a murder mystery for this cause or something, and it has a little bit of a noir aspect to that. It kind of transcends any kind of genre and makes you think that, I don't know, this movie was made by a time traveler or something like that. Somebody who really had quite a vision for an overall movie and who is really, I guess, fluent in all the techniques available, all the techniques in the mainstream and at the fringes across all different genres, putting them together for a really interesting, dynamic, remarkably well-rendered movie. So, honestly, this channel may soon become an Anatol Litvak channel. I am extremely curious about some of his other movies after watching this, because it just seems, like I said, the work of somebody who was totally fluent. Now, there's also great things in the bigger picture. So one thing that's interesting about this movie is that it's kind of disorienting. Disorienting in its pacing, for instance. This is an episodic film that has well-defined chapters that make the movie feel pretty dynamic. There's sort of different shades of drama going on, with different parts having different types of characters. You get a very interesting cross-section of the situation and the circumstances. But the transitions between these chapters are interesting. Some of them are pretty off the wall, pretty strange, pretty disorienting. You move from one sort of tone to another one in a really interesting way. Like I said, this makes the film feel dynamic. It makes it feel experimental, fresh, interesting. There's also some mechanical advantages in this movie. What I mean by that is, earlier, I was saying, the style of the 40s is so mechanical, so mechanical or whatever. It's not suited for this material. But there are places where it's sort of these mechanical twists actually work extremely well. There's a great scene with a rag doll in it. I don't want to spoil the scene because it's just such a great scene. So cleverly written and put together. A great metaphor, really interesting, really clever. And it's it's a 40s mechanical scene, but it absolutely works. A couple other scenes I like in this movie. There's a shock treatment scene. This is interesting because this touches again on sort of the main dilemma of this movie for me, which is that the shock treatment at first seems pretty hokey. You think, oh, come on. Really, we're going to do the shock treatment? This feels like it's sort of bludgeoning the audience to some way, too extreme or something like that. But it's a great scene. I mean, you can't really complain about it. There are some aspects of it to which it's sort of mechanical. But, man, the way it's filmed. I should also mention one of the actors who plays one of the nurses in particular. Don't know who the actress is, but Great casting choice all around. Also, great casting choice for all the random patients, I guess, inmates at the asylum. Really, really well selected, just group of interesting people. Nurses too, doctors as well. Really interesting. A lot of things that seem to ring true there. But like I said, the way that scene is filmed, dynamic cinematography, really, really good. And so the moment after you roll your eyes thinking, oh, we get a shock treatment scene, you're going to be like, man, this is a great scene. There's a scene later on, the My Own Kind scene. I don't want to spoil it exactly, but incredible scene. There's a scene, the dance scene towards the end of the movie. Incredible scene. So like I said, we may be on the verge of this turning into an Anatol Litvak channel. If I had to pick one overall criticism of this movie, it actually would not be the hokey, the mechanical styling. It would actually be that the movie is too short. Like I said, it has different episodes, and there are some that you think, man, I'd like to see this go on longer. This movie is under 2 hours. It could easily be 2.5. There's so much meat. Such a film of a high order, I would say. You know, this movie, like I said, it starts out, you know, kind of seeming like some sort of murder mystery or something like that. But a film of a high order that's remarkably thorough, gives you a lot of different perspectives, that has a really interesting style that, like I said, again, a high order movie it's not a genre film at all. A really interesting movie. So that is The Snake Pit from 1948 with Olivia de Havilland, directed by Anatol Litvak. Like I said, you should check it out. You know, it has some anachronistic moments without a doubt, but overall, I think it's a really interesting and really well-made movie.